All right, everybody. We are here today with Alicia and Rob. Do you go by Rob or Robert?
Rob's fine.
Rob's fine. Well, whichever you prefer. Okay, so we're here with two highly esteemed astrologers who are going to treat us to a view into the 2020 Aries Ingress chart for Australia. The purpose of this event, of course, it's free, and we will be recording this for playback and for those who weren't able to attend live but did sign up and express interest. And we'll send out the link to where that is uploaded probably in a couple of days once everything gets, we've got a whole weekend here. So we've got Australia now, and then later today we'll be looking at the Aries Ingress chart in the UK with Wendy Stacy and Roy Gillett. And then we'll be looking at China and Hong Kong with S.J. Anderson, who I can see is on the call. Hey, S.J. And,
hey, S.J.
Yeah, and Jupiter Lai, and that'll be really exciting. So that's all happening for my today, but and then tomorrow we will be looking at the USA chart, and that will be led by Lee Lehman, and I'm going to be there to support. The purpose of this event is I presented on the Aries Ingress not too long ago in a podcast, and I got quite a few messages. Also, I was doing this this quarantine kind of newsletter thing for a while and did mention some Aries Ingress points. And I was getting a lot of messages and questions about taking a look at Aries Ingress charts for Australia. And the response that I had to give back was, and China, actually, the response was, well, I don't live there. I'm not close enough to the politics. I don't understand. I could talk about the astrology alone, but like having astrological knowledge on its own is useful, but it's not going to be quite what you need to get as much out of it as possible. So through a little bit of pokes and prods, realized it would be a really great opportunity for us to open up the conversation more, and provide this opportunity for folks to explore and get to see what mundane astrology looks like in the hands of some pretty skilled and talented people. So I'm not going to say anything else. Maybe Alicia and Rob, if you guys want to introduce yourselves, I'll turn my video off, but from here, it's up to you. What I'll do is I will monitor the chat box. So if you have a question, please, with just how many people we have on the call, please throw your question in the chat box. I'll keep track of it. And we may ask you to unmute yourself to maybe clarify or add something. But definitely do pop in if you've got a question. All right, we'll turn it over to you guys.
Awesome.
Thanks, Wade.
Thanks so much, Wade. Rob, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure.
The Aries Rising is going to go first.
That's right. Yes. I think I'll go first. Why not? Just quickly. Yeah, I'm an astrologer from Canberra, Australia. I've been studying on and off for roughly 10 years or so. Mainly focused on horary astrology using like traditional techniques and natal astrology. Mundane is something that I've dabbled with over the years, but this is one of my first like real deep dives into it. So I'm excited to, flex my muscles and try out some of the techniques that I've been studying for the Aries Ingress for Australia. Yeah. Alicia, would you like to let people know who you are, if they don't already?
Sure. My name's Alicia Yusuf, and I'm also an Australian astrologer up here on the sunny Sunshine Coast in Queensland. I've had an astrology practice for 15 years, I think, on and off. So yeah, natal, relationship, all of year ahead forecasting, all the things. And I'm also part of the Water Trio podcast. So yeah, I did a bit of a deep dive, having a look at the Australian fires late last year, and just really enjoyed the experience of it. So I too am excited about, kind of flexing the mundane muscles. And I've been studying horary actually with Wade and the crew at STA. So
awesome.
Yeah. So it's kind of fun to have a dive in. So shall we go there? Shall we get the, well, first off, Rob, why is the Aries Ingress chart important?
Okay, yeah, maybe we'll start there with like, what are we talking about when we talk about the Aries Ingress chart? So put simply, if you're familiar with natal astrology, you might know of this concept of the solar return, which is a chart that we cast every year for a person's birthday. And it's kind of like a supplementary chart. Like we use that in addition to the birth chart to get like specific information for the year in question. And that's a pretty common technique that's used by a lot of natal astrologers, and it has been for a very long time. When we bring things into the mundane sphere, which mundane meaning the astrology of the world, mundus means the world in Latin. When we bring it into that sphere, there's no real birthday for the world, but we conveniently use the sun's ingress into Aries, the 0 degrees Aries point. That's the spring equinox in the North Hemisphere, as the world's birthday, in a sort of a symbolic or, not especially literal sense. But these charts that we cast for the moment that the sun moves into Aries each year can give us information about the year ahead. It's a chart that's cast obviously for a moment in time that is the same all around the world. So the chart for the Aries Ingress is going to have the same planets in the same signs, no matter where you are in the world. But when you cast it for your location, generally it's cast for the capital city of a particular nation. Then you get information that's specific to your locality. And when you do that, when you bring that chart down to the local sphere, what you're mainly changing is the houses, the rising sign, the houses, and as a consequence, the rulers of the houses. So those are the pieces of data from the Aries Ingress chart that are specific to a particular location. And that's where you can make specific statements about a nation, a particular nation, even though the Aries Ingress, like I said, is this event that is the same for everyone all around the world. Did that do an adequate job of explaining that,
That was
Alicia?
perfect. That was
Great.
Perfect. And I think
Cool.
the idea that, it really sets the chart up as to, because each house has a symbolic, in mundane astrology, has different symbolism to what many of us are used to in natal astrology. So the way it sets up where each planet is sitting will also change for each country as well. And diving in here, so having a look at this is the Ingress chart. So Rob and I are comfortable with whole sign houses. That's why we choose to use this. I did have a quick look through Reggio, and we'll introduce that. There's just a few side points I want to bring in from a couple of house cusps there, but we're sticking with whole signs for most of the way through this presentation. So just to show, the Aries Ingress chart for Australia. So you can see there, it was at 1:50 p.m. in Canberra on the 20th of March, and it gives us a 6-degree Cancer rising. And what that did was put the nodes right smack bang across that ascendant descendant line, which, that stood out so strongly to me about really Australia coming back to Australians, and the whole idea of, the hunger that we want to be ourselves and to be with ourselves, and the importance of relying on us. The first house in mundane astrology, I'm just looking back to my notes here, but the first house in mundane astrology is really about the nation itself as a whole, the whole big picture of it, the people, the health, the prosperity. And so the idea of this is really our focus has been turned away from what's going on in the outside world and really, into what's going on for us specifically as a country. Especially with that draining south node point sitting there on the 7th house, which is our foreign partnerships or foreign connections, has definitely dropped away. So did you have anything else you wanted to add into that, Rob?
No, I completely agree with what you've said. I think that's the signature, isn't it, really? If the North Node is right on the ascendant in the Ingress chart for Australia, well, that really does look, doesn't it? It looks like we're focusing on ourselves. A really simple way to look at the nodes is just to think about the North Node as being the more button and the South Node as being like the less button. And sometimes when I get a bit too confused with these high and mighty concepts, I just bring it back to simple things like that. And I think if you've got the North Node right on the ascendant, well, that really is saying that it's the nation is going to be looking after itself and its own interests, and that we can. And then in some ways, the resources that we're drawing on will be our own. It's quite sort of personal. I think also the fact that it's Cancer speaks to a certain kind of like familial sentiment, perhaps like you brought that idea of looking after your own and taking care of the family. Those kinds of ideas might come up. I hesitate to go too far down that path because I think there's been some community spirit here, but there's been some lack of it as well. So anyway, I think that's a really striking feature is the nose right on those the ascendant descendant axis, and also with the south node on the descendant, that turning down of interest in the rest of the world, I suppose. The way we've closed our borders, for example, seems to be illustrated there. I think one other thing to note with the Cancer rising, we'll just mention this in passing because it might be on some people's minds, is there's a notion in mundane astrology that when you get a cardinal rising sign in a Aries Ingress chart, it's only it means that the significations of the chart are supposedly not as solid. If you have a fixed sign rising, there's some solidity there, or there's a sense of permanence with a fixed sign that I think symbolizes, it's supposed to symbolize that what you see in the chart will carry through for the whole 12 months. So with the Cancer rising sign, a cardinal rising sign, there's a sense that what we're seeing in this chart potentially might only be true for the first part of the year. Now, I'm not really sure how much stock to put in that. I sometimes feel like that can be over-egged a bit, and perhaps the Aries Ingress chart is true for the whole year, but maybe you can bring in the other cardinal ingress charts as well if you want that extra detail. And if we do have a cardinal rising like we do here, I don't want to waylay us too much, but I just want to mention that point, that the other thing to note about the rising sign is that it's cardinal. So what we're seeing here is probably, if that theory holds true, will only be, what we're saying here might be most accurate over the next 3 months and might fade a bit or be less pertinent later in the year.
Although we did talk to the fact that, in our pre-show chat about the fact that the Cancer ingress is actually almost exactly the same because it has a 6-degree Cancer rising too. So I think we can be pretty assured in the fact that this will strongly hold for at least 6 months in terms of the way the outer planets especially are playing out in which houses. And, really when we think about it, what we want to do, also just to that North Node in Cancer, we're seeing around the world as that North Node has been moving through Cancer, nationalism, everyone coming back to their own country very strongly. And I think it's something that is potentially happening and being flavoured here in Australia too, is that pulling back of, okay, we're more about us and less about being a global economy or less about being, a global nation. So it'd be interesting to see how that plays out. And, really looking to that moon here, let me see if I can get the drawing tools up. Looking to that moon here in Aquarius, which is ruling the chart, we've got that there in 13 degrees of Aquarius in the 8th house. So in mundane astrology, the 8th house rules the death and death rates, and they loom large. So look, it's definitely, and the moon is the common people. So it's definitely been something that we've been talking about, and not just our own death rates, but the death rates around the world have definitely been a big, strong thing. And I think this links a lot to COVID-19. But I'd also say that another part of this 8th house is that the 8th house rules foreign investment and financial relationships with other countries. And this is going to be a follow-on from this, and it already was. I know we were already concerned about our financial position from the bushfires and off the back of the bushfires and what that was going to mean. But now with COVID-19 and everything going on in place, and a major trade and 32% of our exports go to currently is not buying, is not in a position to be buying. And having a look, I had a quick look at some of the export indexes yesterday, and we're down at least 30% to China alone, although still tracking well with Japan and South Korea, which is interesting. But yeah, Rob, did you have any thoughts about that?
That's an interesting point. I think when you look at the moon in the 8th house, of course, it's something that we can't dance around. It's the house of death, and that is concerning, I suppose. I think the other thing to mention is that the moon, regardless of which house it rules in mundane astrology, signifies the people, the masses. It's one of its natural or universal significations is the masses. So when you see the planet signifying the common people, in the 8th house in a chart for, we're in a pandemic. It does worry you a little bit to see that. And I'm not sure, I don't want to make any big statements about that, but it does make me concerned. I mean, it's hard to downplay or talk around that. Has to be acknowledged. But I think that there's something nice to see there in the square to Venus in the 11th, because I do think there's a risk there. Other than death, obviously the 8th is connected with finances, and you've mentioned that. I think there's a risk there that we get ourselves into a bit of a financial crisis or a debt type situation as a result of the pandemic. I think that's something that it's not just going to be restricted to Australia, but here in this chart you can see it quite clearly with the moon in the 8th. It's like the people are going to be coughing up some dough. I think how are we going to pay for all of this stimulus and everything? Well, it's going to come from us. It's from the people.
But
with the square to Venus.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, keep going.
Oh no, you're right. I'm happy to.
No, because you were going where I was going, so that's fine.
Oh yeah, because I think the square to Venus is encouraging a bit. And if we just keep it simple for a moment, it's a close square, so it's one of the more striking aspects in the chart. It kind of leaps out at you.
It's the next aspect the moon makes, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and it's with Venus, so it's a benefic planet. Venus is in its domicile, so it's strong. It's in the 11th house, which is a good house. It's a succeedent house as well, so it's a good placement for Venus. So the Venus is doing potentially doing a lot to help the moon out and sort of throw it a helping hand, I guess. And if the Venus is in the 11th, then it rules the 11th too. In mundane astrology, the 11th house is associated with the friends and allies of the country. So potentially we could be helped out by our foreign friends. And when we're talking about friends, we don't just mean, I think Indonesia maybe wouldn't count as a friend. I'm thinking about our close allies, there might be some agreements. UK. Yeah, UK, US, New Zealand. Yep. These are the countries that we have major treaties with. And those are the kinds of countries I look to when I'm thinking about the 11th. So potentially some foreign aid or some help from overseas there. But the other thing the 11th shows, according to CEO Carter's Mundane Astrology book and a few other people, is Parliament and local government as well. So I think there's a sense that there's going to be some cooperation here between the government and the people to try and overcome this. It's not going to be easy because it's a square aspect. So I think there's going to be some tension between the people and the government right now, and the way that the state governments are responding. There might just be some disgruntlement or some difficulty in enacting what the government's trying to do to assist us with this.
We're already saying in the Venusian links, anyone who knows anyone in the entertainment industry, film industry, music industry right now knows that they're not getting anything because of the way that their pay is structured and their salaries are structured. So they're not, of course, everything that they do. So Venus rules entertainers, musicians. It also rules women and birth rates and children and things like that in mundane astrology. But it also rules entertainers and musicians. And so what we're seeing is a whole industry on the verge of potentially collapsing unless the two parts of our government can agree. So the Liberal government right now are standing against putting a package in for people who work in those industries, where the Labor government is trying to push it through. So it'll be interesting to see what actually happens in those parliamentary rooms to end up supporting this, because we have a massive entertainment industry that's actually a big part of our export market now too, because we have a lot of overseas films that are filmed here. So it's really important to keep that industry propped up. And as a friend of mine said, who's a composer, he's like, I think someone's actually put a petition out, but let's try and spend the weekend without any entertainment this weekend. If you want to try not listening to music, not watching movies, not having art on your walls, and see what happens. So,
that's a nightmare. For someone with so much Venus in my chart, that's just a horrific idea.
Exactly.
Yeah. Hey guys,
we never miss the water till it's gone.
Hey, sorry. So we've got a question in the chat box. So Anna has asked if you've given any thought to how you might think of Saturn moving over the moon. Of course, that's going to be some time from now, but I think it opens up to a wider question of transits to major configurations like this. And of course, Mars is basically transiting over that moon right now.
Yes.
So I don't know if
exactly.
you have any thoughts about, kind of triggers to this point and what you expect to jump out of something like that. But I just told Anna that I would voice that question for her.
Sure. Yeah, and absolutely. We have had a think about the transits and what's going on. And, especially, yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want to get into that right now, Rob, or put it towards the end?
I had some notes about transits, but I must admit they were mainly focused on the transits to the chart for Australia, which we're going to bring up a little bit later on. I wasn't really looking at transits to the Ingress chart itself. I was mainly looking at transits to the swearing in chart and bringing that in as like another piece of context for what's going on around here. But I do think conceptually, like it's probably like a valid technique to use the Ingress chart as like a baseline, and then to use predictive techniques on the Ingress chart itself. Like people do that for solar returns and things. And I think that seems like a valid concept or practice, but it's not something that I've looked at for tonight's session. Yeah.
I've had a look at a couple. The one I thought with Saturn I didn't include, mostly because it's not going to happen within this year. So, or within even this whole Ingress year. So I didn't include that. With the Mars going over, it basically is the frustration of people trying to get their welfare payments from the government right now, because there's huge everybody's registered their interest, they're not calling back. So for those who are overseas, the Australian government has offered for anybody who can show, especially sole traders or people who've become unemployed, they can get the job seekers allowance, and then on top of that it will be doubled to cope with this time. But because they just didn't expect to have the influx of people trying to get to this, there's mass frustration out there, and everybody's trying to get into the Centrelink page, which is our main welfare payments, to be able to get these kinds of things as well, which interestingly enough in the Cancer Ingress chart, the moon is actually in the 12th house, which is where mundane astrology welfare payments sit. So my feeling is that there will be a switch, but right now we're just feeling the real frustrations of that. I think we'll get to the next. There is one I wanted to talk about, the Mars retrograde that's going to be happening right on the MC there. But we'll get to that when we get past the next bit. But the last thing I wanted to bring in just about that Venus was the fact that Venus also rules the 4th house. And in mundane astrology, the 4th house is the land and mining industries and things that we pull out of the land. So my feeling with that as well is our primary industry in Australia, our iron ore, our coal, our precious metals that we export overseas will still continue to be needed, and that will help prop us up. Whereas in other countries that potentially manufacturing and things like that are not as needed won't have that protective force in place as well, because you can't make stuff, especially China, without a lot of the minerals and mining resources that Australia has to offer, including gas. So yeah,
that's a really good point.
Shall we move on to the 7th house?
I think that's the other big one, because I think the two signatures in there's 3 signatures in the chart that are really important. One is the nodes, the other is the Moon Venus square, and the third thing that really jumps out at you when you look at this chart is the Jupiter Mars conjunction, with Pluto also joining in the fun in the 7th house. So I think both agreed that from a global perspective, because if we pull out from Australia and just think about Jupiter Mars conjunction, what that means for the world in general, Mars, one of the things that Mars signifies in mundane astrology, and it has for a long time, is epidemics. And so with Jupiter, a planet that tends to increase and sort of turn the volume up on planets that it comes into contact with, in a very close conjunction with Mars in the Aries Ingress chart, it does illustrate, I think, the pandemic quite well. And then with Pluto there also, I mean, if we're talking about planets that turn the volume up on planets that they touch, you've got both of them there. Pluto and Jupiter both have that reputation, or that sort of that signification of increasing things and inflaming and exacerbating things. So just globally, that Jupiter-Mars conjunction does seem to illustrate, I think, the pandemic with Pluto there. And also when you talk about, nasty placements for Jupiter, I mean, it's right in the mix with Saturn and the South Node also in Capricorn. And so I think when you bring that into the Australian perspective, it lands in the 7th house. So that pandemic sort of signature in the chart lands in the 7th, which I think is probably, from our perspective at least, from Australia's perspective, like not the worst place for it, because that's foreign countries. It's the 7th house signifies overseas places and foreign countries. So in some ways that's not the worst place for it to land, because it shows that it's primarily the threat is landing overseas, and the threat to us is coming in from overseas. And that's actually supported by the data that I've been looking at today on infection rates and transmission and things like that, because still I think the vast majority of people who have been infected are people who've come from overseas, who've returned to the country, or people who've been in very close contact with those people. So I think we've managed to keep, I think, fingers crossed, so far so good, the spread amongst people who haven't traveled internationally. We tried to keep, I think that's keeping okay for now. I think that 7th house placement speaks to the fact that it seems to be happening to, like, quote unquote other people over there. But there's still a lot of threat to Australians, as we can see by the moon in the 8th. So, we're far from escaping this, but I think that 7th house placement speaks to the fact that we're seeing this crisis overseas, and we're very freaked out by what's happening in foreign countries, particularly America, Italy, etc. Here it hasn't quite gotten so bad yet, thank God. So that's just the 7th house, though. There's a lot of other things to talk about with that conjunction. Alicia, did you want to come in with something?
Well, Saturn itself also in mundane rules plagues, and one of the things is that Saturn rules both that 7th house and that 8th house, and for everybody, all over the world, that Saturn in this ingress chart is in the last degree of Capricorn, which it rules. So it's telling us that something's going to change soon. There will be a change soon. Ruling the 7th house, it tells me that there's going to be a change in foreign policy and our foreign connections and our foreign trade partners. And I really feel like we are going to see some real shifts in perhaps some of the trading agreements that we have, some of the connections that we have, some of the people we can rely on, some of those that we can't. My feeling also about that Mars, if you use the outer planets as malefics, that poor old Jupiter's besieged there. He's between Mars, he's between Pluto, and also in Saturn's sign. And there's this idea that sometimes he can offer bonification or support to a planet that's applying to him, especially a faster planet. But I just don't see in this case that he can. And in many ways, all he's doing is expanding that Mars energy. So in mundane astrology, Mars rules soldiers and the military. It rules potential war. It rules industrial action. And that might be something that we start to see as industries go back to work that have been kept out, that need more structure in place, or that need propping up and need supporting by the government. We might see some strikes happening, or some pressure being put on government and industries, especially the entertainment one we're just talking about. So I think that's a possibility. However, Mars also rules fire and firefighters and our fire brigades. And we are slated to have a warmer than average winter that is going to be drier than average. And I'm not saying really dry, but drier than average on our eastern states. So the potential, if this goes long range, is that we will have more fires towards the end of the year. Fingers crossed, I hope not. Fingers crossed we've learned a lot from what we've just been through. But I do wonder whether or not that's something that's there too. And I feel like there's some big signatures with this. you know, this is a point that Jupiter will be going back and forward over. And I think that we'll get some definite indices of what the potential of that Mars is as planets come up to that 22 degrees. So, you know, we'll be looking at Jupiter coming up back to that 22-degree point. Just having a quick check here. Yeah, so we're looking middle of July, and then again, it will be in early November. So that'll kind of highlight, open up, and especially November. You know, that is when fire season starts for us here in Australia too. So, or it could be that the government actually sees us doing some things of helping our firefighters and changing our policies towards what's been given to them in the past. So yeah, that's a curio I've got on my mind with it all. But I do really feel like, you know, and it's no surprise with what the whole world's going through, is that our foreign policies will change. But I think, you know, it's so, you know, we shut that gate quick fast, way faster than a lot of other countries did, and we shut it firm. And I think, you know, from what you were saying, one of the major, you know, New South Wales is probably the highest contagious state in Australia, and they're saying the reason was because a cruise ship came in, and the government, New South Wales Health Department allowed them to get off the cruise ship right in the middle of the city and then catch trains out to the airport. And they just saw that really, you know, has made a massive rate of infection. So I think, you know, that was a really good point you were saying, that it was actually quite literally people that came from overseas and were just traveling through. They weren't even people, residents or people who lived here. They were literally trying to get off a cruise ship and get on a plane, and they created a lot of infection. So yeah, that would be what I'd say with that as well. So Wade, were there any other questions that could be pertinent at this point?
Well, let's have a look and see if nothing's really come through the chat box that seems to jump up. But are there any, we can open this up in the chat box, 2 questions to see if anybody's got anything they want to kind of prompt. There's obviously been a lot of discussion about other kinds of events coming up later. So there was a discussion about the eclipse that's coming on the 21st of June at 0
Yes,
Cancer.
we're going to be talking to that in a minute. Yep.
And then some conversation about Saturn-Uranus square, which doesn't perfect this year, but does get closer and closer together.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, we've got to actually have a look, and I'm just trying to move my cursor. I don't know why it's not working. Oh, there we go. To get onto the next slide.
No questions have come in, so you feel free to keep moving.
Okay, cool. So this is the swearing in chart for Australia, and so this is the base chart that we're going off, and there's some really interesting things that you'll note, especially if we go to the next slide, and you can see we've got both of them in together. So the swearing in chart is the center chart, and the Aries Ingress chart is the one on the outside. And one of the big points that we see is the fact that the midheaven and the ascendant are really closely aligned. So we have an Aries ascendant here in Australia for our swearing in chart, which was the 1st of January 1901. And this is a timing that was rectified by Ed Tamplin, may he rest in peace, but he's someone I really trust around mundane astrology. So this is the timing that we've chosen to go with, isn't it, Rob? Because
yeah, that's right. So this is kind of like the birth chart for Australia. Yes, he did. I think they actually got the video of when they were sworn in and timed how long it took. So it's about as accurate as you're going to get. Yeah. So when you overlay the Aries Ingress chart onto the birth chart for Australia, you get some extra information, and it really, I think, provides a better level of accuracy. So, we'll bring in both those charts and sort of compare them. Yeah. And yeah, as Alicia said, that I think that first thing that you notice is the way the angles line up between the 2 charts, which I think, you know, it seems to sort of bring, if you think about the symbolism of the ascendant and the midheaven, well, the ascendant in mundane astrology is connected with the first house, which is the nation as a whole, like holistically, it's the nation itself as a monolith. And then the MC is obviously associated with the government and with the people in power. So that alignment of the MC in the Aries Ingress chart with the ascendant for Australia, I think that just, well, it blends those two themes together. So there's an intimate connection right now, a kind of a linking of hands between the government and the people, I think. Or with maybe you could say the government takes the reins of the nation, which they certainly have. You can criticize the response, but they've certainly responded and responded forcefully eventually. So I think that's what that alignment is showing for me. But did you have any other thoughts about what that might mean?
I think it also brings us up, if you think about the midheaven as what uplifts us as a nation, I think it's also the fact it aligns very well with the North Node on the ascendant of the Ingress as well. That idea that, we're really looking to our government to support us, and the government is working really hard to do it. And I think in terms of the response, we are very lucky in Australia that we've had the response that we've had. Sadly, it probably comes off the back of the bushfires and the lack of response at that time, but it seems we have learnt the lessons, and that's a possibility there as well.
Yeah, and I think that's that sense of the government responding and sort of coming in and really trying to do something here can be seen not only in that alignment of the angles, but also just in the Aries Ingress chart itself. You have Mars conjunct Jupiter. In the Aries Ingress chart, which I think was the previous slide, Jupiter rules the 6th house, which is illness, and Mars rules the 10th house, which is the government. So you see the government taking, really taking an active role in trying to manage the pandemic in the Aries Ingress chart. And then when you overlay that chart onto the chart for Australia, it lands in the 10th house. So again, there's this sort of sense that the government is really involved in this and is really not sitting on its hands, which I think it's kind of striking to see that that sort of 10th house themes coming up again and again, kind of rippling through these charts. So I think that's mainly what I wanted to say about just the fact that Jupiter Mars lands in the 10th in the Australian chart. But I think that's not just necessarily good news for the government, because that's a very tough pile-up in Capricorn. It's landing in the 10th. So the government's actually, while it's definitely got this pandemic in the forefront of its mind because it's right there in its own house, you can't ignore something that's in your living room, but the problem is that it's just so challenging. There's so much tough stuff to deal with there. Saturn rules the 10th, so it's in its own domicile and it's angular, so it's strong. So it has some ability to deal with this, but my goodness, it's under a lot of stress. So I think that's going to be a lot of challenges for the government this year. No surprises there, but you can see it very clearly illustrated in the chart with that 10th house pile up.
And our own Saturn, we've just had a Saturn return in Australia, and our own Saturn actually sits on that descendant as well. So I think there will be that we can be a very dry country, and very kind of cut and dried with what we're willing to do and what we aren't. So there is that sense with this of, okay, yes, we will reach this agreement or not, kind of coming back to what's important for us.
Yeah, very earthy country. With Mars.
And we rely on our Earth.
Yeah, we got Moon and Taurus in the nation's chart. You've got Mars ruling the chart in Virgo. You've got Saturn conjunct the Sun in so it's a lot of Earth. And I think that's one of the sort of the national characteristics, if you can call it, of Australians, is that sense of being an earthy, down to earth kind of, working class hero type stereotype. But I think that will really be called upon at the moment. Like that, we will tap into that earthy resilience a lot in the next year. Yeah, thanks for highlighting that alignment. Did you want to talk to that? Because I think that's a really important one to note.
So just that the fact that the Aries, so we were already talking before about the protective mechanism of that Venus, and here she's even more strongly protective because we literally, as a nation, so the 2nd house is our financial resources and what we draw on as a country. And we have always drawn on our minerals and our primary production, our farming, and all those kinds of things. So the fact that Venus is coming closely aligned to our moon in the second house there, just shows that we will be able to kind of draw ourselves up from what has always been there, the resources we've always been able to rely upon. So anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's about digging deep and tapping into our resources. And I think that's not just our financial resources, but I think it's about the resources of the people as well. I think it's about the hip pocket of the ordinary Australian. And I think we're going to be asked to really, I mean, a lot of people already are. It's a real crisis for a lot of people financially right now.
Yeah.
So the second house emphasis is not surprising. I think you're right. I think when you look at the fact that you've got this moon in the Aries Ingress chart that's in a received square to Venus. So it's in Venus is in the exaltation of the moon, which makes that aspect a bit more positive. And then on top of that, Venus is sitting like very close to the moon in the nation's birth chart. I think that what that shows is that I think there's a sense that we might weather this storm. Like these are fixed signs. Venus is strong in Taurus, and in the nation's chart we've got the moon exalted in Taurus. So I think financially and economically we might fare better than other countries in all of this. Like every country is going to take a blow. This is not a scenario where there are really going to be big winners. I don't think from like a national perspective. There might be winners in terms of individual corporations, and there might be individuals who profit from this. But I don't think this is about profit. I just think that points to the economy perhaps surviving the blows that this deals. But then again, we have to keep in mind that 8th house placement of the moon in the Aries Ingress chart that might talk, so speaks a bit about debt, I think, possibly as well.
And I think as well, that moon square Venus too speaks to, because, Venus in a mundane chart rules marriage issues and birth rates. And I think, we are seeing a lot of couples stuck at home right now. I'm hearing more and more people going, I've had enough of my partner. So there is that tension between that moon and that Venus that the common people are feeling of, or feeling stressed because they're homeschooling their kids, or they're literally financially stressed too. What that's going to do to the marriage and potentially divorce rates of Australia. I wonder what's going to happen there. And also the birth rates. We're stuck at home with not much else to do.
Well,
especially those who don't have older kids.
Yeah. We were just commiserating off air about how hard it is to have kids at home at the moment. And maybe the Moon Venus square talks to a bit of that. But I do think, it's a pretty positive looking thing to see there. But I wonder, I wasn't going to talk, I think I might just note that there's a very close lineup with the part of fortune there, but I must admit, I don't really use the part of fortune in mundane astrology, and I'm not quite sure what you would do with it. There might be a lot of interesting things, but I have not really looked into how you might delve into that. So just something interesting to note is how just very close that alignment is between the part of fortune and the Aries Ingress and the moon.
Yeah. Actually, Wade, do you have anything to weigh in on there?
With the part of fortune.
Yeah.
Do you use that in mundane?
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't put a whole lot of weight on the part of fortune myself. I think I'm kind of, and I also should admit that I follow the Ptolemaic formula for the part of fortune, and I think that there's some pretty good reasoning for that. So I don't flip it, whether it's a day or night chart. But I think when we're taking a look at the part of fortune, a lot of the conversation tends to be about material goods and material reality, and that can also be physical bodies. So I mean, in a birth chart, it makes a little bit more sense sometimes to pick up on that theme when we're talking about national pandemics, and the impact that has on the community's ability to earn, and also there's also, there's a body count, there's a mortality rate, associated with the pandemic, of course. It would be an interesting point that I think probably, Rob, I wouldn't have even looked at it, but the connection to the moon, I think, is, at the very least, pointing some kind of indication here that there's an opportunity for Australia to come out ahead financially as a result of how they manage this year. The thing is, when markets are in such heavy swing, it only takes a couple really clever moves to ride the wave back up. And this seems to me like, if you've got the moon and Venus both in Taurus, that this is about listening to the national leadership of probably women or those who are connected to the earth. So people who are working with mining communities or natural commodities or things of those natures. But I don't have any particular point to make. It's just off the top of my head. But we do have some questions for you guys.
Well, hang on, just to that, and then back to the questions. So our Prime Minister's sun is at 20 degrees of Taurus, and he is our ex-treasurer, and he's actually a very he's not my favorite person. I'm not getting into politics here, but he is very astute financially.
So that's the other side is sometimes you can take natural signification, which was what I just did, or you can take particular signification, which is what you did, and particular always wins out. So it's the same thing with Donald Trump. If you take a look at the 2000 Saturn-Jupiter conjunction with, I think it was 29 degrees Leo was rising, or maybe 28. But that chart more or less reflected Trump's own birth chart. So, if he was to run a 20-year cycle, it really lifts up his ability to be able to get into office. And he becomes kind of the remembered thing at the end. So I think if you've got national figures who plug into this, that's about everything you need to know. And I can almost guarantee you that those are the conversations, looking at this Aries Ingress, those are the conversations he's having now about, positioning Australia as well as he can throughout this crisis.
Yeah. Cool. All right. So questions.
Yeah. Are you ready for questions? Okay. We've got a few. So let me just go ahead and scroll back up. Do you have any thoughts about Uranus sitting in the second house? So that right there at 4 Taurus. The question really, it's not just the Uranus, it's also wondering if that offsets something about Venus being in Taurus in the second, or how do you see that?
Personally, I've been watching this Uranus, because this is a transit that's been going on since mid-2018 for Australia, full stop. And I'm wondering about, this is about our land and our resources, and wondering whether or not there are going to be innovations around farming techniques that are needing to happen due to the droughts that are going on. There's a lot being done by the CSIRO right now, trying to work out how we can have drought resistant plants or things like that. So that's the potential there for that. Yes, there's definitely going to be shake-ups with Uranus. It's like throwing in a grenade at times. And I think in the coming Taurus season, we'll get more of a view on what the potentials of that will be. But yeah, Rob, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I probably mirror your thoughts. It's something that I think is that's a story that's going to play out on a broader time scale than the one we're really focusing on tonight. But I do think that with Uranus in Taurus, and Taurus being the second house in the nation's chart, that instability in finances is on the cards, but also potentially innovations and new ways of doing things. But and you can kind of, I suppose, already see that in what's happening right now with everyone sort of working from home and things like that, and trying to innovate ways to make money when everything is so different to the way it used to be. But I think, I'm still watching that and thinking about how that will play out. I think one thought I had was with if Uranus is moving through our second house, and we rely so heavily on mining in this country, whether that transit might mean that we have to start rethinking that or supplementing that, or that there might be some kind of need to reassess our reliance on the earth to pay our way in
Yep.
in the world. But
And
I think
climate
that,
change will create that too, in terms of how we rely on farming as well, you know.
yeah, that's right. And I think that's something that for the whole world, I mean, in a sense, because Taurus is even globally is sort of loosely connected with these ideas like land and food. That's something that the world is dealing with, but very particularly for Australia, because we have that Aries rising chart, it does make that even more sort of the case for us. And I think when we think about our money coming from the land, whether that's through our dairy industry or through our mining industry or other types of
Our
agriculture
wheat
and farming.
industry, our wool industry, we're
and
a
that's
big primary production.
Yeah, and then we have the moon, which is the ruler of the fourth house of land, etc., in the second house in our birth chart, in our nation's birth chart. So quite clearly to see there, and the Uranus is going to come across, transit that moon, which is a very sensitive point in anyone's chart. So I think it's going to be an interesting one to watch, but I don't think we're going to necessarily see the full story of that transit this year.
No, because that's not happening until 2023. So
yeah, that's right. So, but certainly this is not going to help. If Uranus is a destabilizing kind of, you know, vaguely malefic planet, then, you know, look, it could work out well. The other thing that Uranus brings is innovation. You know, it forces you to have a crisis, and then out of that comes a new way of doing things. So it's not necessarily doom and gloom.
Do you want another question, or do you want to move on?
Let's talk quickly about the eclipses, because this might answer some of those questions that are there. So there's going to be two eclipses, and one of the ones that we saw that we wanted to highlight is this one here. So this is actually the lunar eclipse that's going to be happening on the 6th of June. And it's going to be happening across quite a sensitive point, which is this Uranus-Pluto opposition that is in our national chart. And when we had our Pluto opposition, which was Pluto sitting on that Uranus, that was the same year, that was 2001, 2002. So we had the Tampa, we had the children overboard, and then we had the Bali bombings. So we had three really major issues with ninth house foreign affairs things that were quite, that really evoked that Pluto of, we were making unusual decisions. I remember living in London at the time, and people were really questioning, why is Australia doing what they're doing? The turning back the boats, forcing children to throw their children overboard. Why aren't they just allowing refugees to come in? So there's that kind of the real heaviness of Pluto and the power, but the really, Uranian decision of just these shock tactics that they were using to try to get people to stop coming to our country. So my question on this, or my ponder on this, is how would this eclipse light that up? What potentials are we looking at for this? Are there going to be, really big shifts around how we deal with our with other nations? And I think as well, because one of our biggest exports that many people do not realize, especially to China, is our service industry, which is education. We have a massive amount of overseas and international students come to Australia to get educated. And I think this speaks a lot to that third and that ninth house of, what's actually stopped, how that's going to impact on our learning industries here in Australia, which is third house, education systems, and what that's going to mean in terms of the influx of money there. And I don't know, if there's going to have to be really cut and dried decisions made about whether or not international students are allowed in, how we deal with them, what we do. Yeah, so that's kind of my big ponder on that. What about you, Rob? Have you got any thoughts about that?
Yeah, the eclipse really hit up that third and ninth axis, and the ninth house and the third really are very important houses in the Australian chart. There's obviously that stellium there in Sagittarius. And I think that's very much sort of part of the Australian sort of, I think, national character, is that Sagittarian optimism and that outward looking kind of perspective. But with the nodes moving through Gemini and Sagittarius for the next little while. We're going to have eclipses lighting up that axis and really, I think, making us rethink and really look closely at the way we do relate to foreign countries. Because I think one thing you can say about the Australian chart is it's a bit imbalanced towards foreign interest. And the other signature in the Australian chart that speaks to that, not just the pile up in the ninth, we've got both benefic planets in the ninth. So where do we look for our sort of rewards and things is overseas. So where do we look for our benefit is from somewhere else. With our chart ruler Mars in the 6th house in the Australian chart, that's kind of a subservient placement. And I think that speaks to Australia often letting other countries boss us around, because the 6th is connected with servants and in the ancient world with slaves and just generally people who get bossed around. So our relationship with England obviously has been very strained over the 20th century. And then we shifted to being a very close ally with America. And we just
also
tend to be
getting bossed around by them.
Yeah, we tend to be this little ally of these bigger, more important countries. And I think that role of being the servant to these dominant players is something you see in that Mars in the 6th. But back to my point, that this emphasis on other countries, I think, is really going to be tested with the eclipse series in Gemini Sag over the next little while. I think one really striking thing about this eclipse is, apart from the fact that it lands right on the Uranus-Pluto opposition, is that we've got this very tight T-square to Mars in Pisces. And that's a really intense aspect to see. It's placed in the 12th house if you overlay it on the Australian chart, which we've done here. Now, if Mars rules the rising sign, then it's connected with the country as a whole. So Mars in some way signifies Australia just generally. If Mars is in the 12th and T-squaring this opposition, I think when you have the ruler of the rising sign in the 12th house, certainly in horary and natal astrology, that can often be an indication that the person involved has a tendency to do things that are against their best interest, or that they'll do things that are self-defeating or self-destructive in some way. So I wonder whether what this eclipse means for Australia is there might be some significant missteps taken at this time, or some kind of action that is later seen to be something that we regret. And if that's hitting this 3rd and 9th axis, that does, I think it just emphasizes what you were talking, I think, about, well, what's our relationship like with these foreign powers and the education sector with the 3rd and 9th. So,
and our tourism sector as well with the 9th too.
Yeah, that's right. So I think there could be some mistakes made potentially around this time. I think another thing to note, it's not really hitting the eclipse, but it's just interesting to see that Jupiter and Pluto come back together again. In the eclipse chart around that same degree of the Jupiter-Mars conjunction. So it just looks like, again, like more issues with the pandemic. If Jupiter rules the 6th house, signifying illness, then that makes me a little bit worried. But I think the main thing that leaps out at me is that Mars. So when I saw that, I was a little concerned that perhaps, some errors might be made. The other thing to think about with 12th house placement of Mars is hospitals and nursing homes and welfare. So these systems that support the most vulnerable people in our society might be put under a lot of strain at this time, or might, I think that might be a theme that comes up is some sort of pressure or challenge involving those systems. So that's a little concerning when we're talking about pandemics. I'd hate to see.
Mars in Pisces being compassion in action. We could literally see just a lot of activity happening in these places that's like focused on trying to get people well, trying to get people better, trying to put the people first ahead of other things. but that
Yeah, well, Mars
would
is
in the end be a
action.
bit sabotaging.
Yeah, and I think with the Neptune there might also be a sense of like some sort of mistake or something that seems like a good idea at the time. Anyway, I don't hesitate to predict doom for us now. I want to uplift people and make them
Yep.
feel optimistic. But yeah, that eclipse, it's an intense one with that Mars.
Yep. Yep. So Wade, more questions. I mean, there's one more transit I want to talk about, but let's have some more questions, then we'll get to that.
So there was some conversation here about Venus retrograde in the third square, the natal Mars of the Australian chart, if there's any thoughts about that. So I think we've got Mars here at 11 Virgo, and then Venus 12 Gem.
Yeah, Venus is dragged into the eclipse here. It's sort of a very important part of the eclipse story, actually, is that Venus being there. And if we think about...
she'll just be past her Kazemi point in that too. Yeah.
So pardon me. So when we're thinking about what Venus signifies, well, it's ruling the second house. So it signifies, the resources and the finances of the nation. But it's placed in the third. So I think what this perhaps shows is that impact of foreign investment and how much our education system is weighted towards bringing in foreign students and things like that. That might have a financial impact of some sort. Yeah, it certainly brings resources and finances into the story of this eclipse. So I'm thinking that, I think with Venus retrograde and in Gemini, which is not, Venus doesn't really have any particular strength there. I think it might have term rulership there in Egyptian terms, but this is getting into the nitty gritty. I think if exaltation and domicile are the main heavy hitters for dignity. So I don't think the Venus is doing particularly well there. It's also combust. So if we're talking about the financial situation, and we just talked about the fact that the Moon and Venus alignment in the Ingress chart looks quite nice for Australia's economy, but here we see maybe some signs that there might be some blows dealt. And I think that will be connected with those third and ninth house themes, and also perhaps the 12th house with Mars being there. So that's what I thought when I saw the Venus there. It was primarily about our resources and our economy.
Okay, so then we also had a question about Mercury ruling the chart's 6th house, and the south node of the eclipse is on that Mercury. If there's any thoughts about that.
You see.
Yes. So the 6th house is public servants and the public service. And also we were talking about this in the pre-show chat. This is our tradespeople. This is the people who work really hard for the country. So there is this sense that they are going to be drained, that there's going to be people who are going to be working really hard right now to be doing a lot of things. And I've got friends who are linked to Centrelink, and I know that they are working crazy hour days to be able to get everything done and get everything happening. So whether or not there's something in the eclipse that kind of puts pressure on this situation to create that and to push that forward. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. I think that actually the pressure on the working man, if you like, is something that comes up again and again in these charts. In the Aries Ingress chart, if we can turn our minds back to that, the ruler of the 6th house is Jupiter. And it's placed in Capricorn, so it's fallen. It's conjunct Mars, so it's beaten up. It's angular at least, so that's something. But it's still not in a great condition. It's also, conjunct Pluto. It's also co-present with the South Node and with Saturn. So the working man, if you like, the working class, and also to some, I think with the 6th house, you can also bring in civil servants, public service, and those public services like ambulance, police, public hospitals, etc.
Teachers.
All teachers, all under a lot of strain right now, really, really finding it hard. And that comes up again in the with the eclipse chart, as has just been pointed out. I think it also comes up in the Cancer Ingress chart as well, if I'm not mistaken. You can see it there as well. If I can just quickly, I'm going to pull it up on my own computer just to make sure. Yeah, you've got the Lord of the Sixth, Jupiter in Capricorn again, retrograde, and conjunct Pluto. So there's this theme in all of these charts, despite what I've said about the economy going okay, of the services that the government provides being really, really hit hard, and also that working people will be hit really hard by this. So there's a difference between the economy in a sort of a national, from the perspective of the nation, and the well-being and of the people, and I think perhaps what we're seeing, and it's in the discourse at the moment, is the extent to which looking after the economy is caring for the people. Like, what is the difference between caring for the economy and caring for the people, if you like?
Yeah.
And where do those things line up, and where do they not line up? Those kinds of big sort of political themes. But yeah, I think that's a really good point, that the South Node's transiting the Lord of the Sixth in the nation's chart at that time.
And also the Lord of the Third, which is where this Venus retrograde is going to be happening as well. And I think we're going to be re-establishing our priorities and our values of what living a life of luxury actually means. What is abundance right now? What are our priorities right now? Do we have to have all the things right now? Because I don't think we're going to be able to import like we used to be either.
Yeah.
So I do feel like, people are going to be really scaling back what they can buy, what they can purchase, and what services they're able to give, services they're able to access. And I think having a look already at the retail sector here in Australia, you just have to drive around. You see how many shops are closing down, how much online's already been taken over. I think this is going to change our retail landscape in a massive way. It was like the shove that for an industry that was probably already teetering on the edge of the cliff. So it'll be interesting to see how that kind of plays out too with this Venus retrograde time in general.
Yeah, that's really true. I think I had another point, but I think that's something separate. I might save that I might just hold that one in my hip pocket.
Sure.
Let me see if I have any other notes on the eclipse.
While you're looking, just one, I think, good comment and observation coming from the chat is that the sixth house also points to, the underclass or those who are socioeconomically hit hardest. And that a lot of your observations will be, really great things to think about for those who are less advantaged.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that's being pointed out right now is that, people who've been living on the job seeker, which is $550 a fortnight, they're getting the benefit of this COVID-19 payment. And they're saying that this proves that the vulnerable have been kept vulnerable because the government hasn't been giving them the support they should have. Because now they're realizing that, most Australians cannot live on that amount of money. So, it's the idea of bringing it back to a universal wage potentially, or trying to bring some equality back into the system for everybody, so it's the vulnerable are pulled up along with everybody else in this situation as well. So fingers crossed that's a possibility, but I don't know. That eclipse is a specific period in time. So, if we have a look back at the Ingress chart.
Yeah, the Ingress chart really does, like, the most vulnerable planet in the Ingress chart is probably Jupiter, which it's the most threatened. I think even is angular, we can't ignore that, but everything else.
But angular just means it gets to
it's prominent
bad juju out into the world.
Yeah, and so that's quite a sobering thing to see. And I think it's hard to gloss over that.
Yeah.
So we talk a lot about, oh, how nice it looks to see the moon square Venus and, you know, that sort of stuff. But yeah, the sixth house is associated in mundane astrology with like just the working people, like workers, in that sort of Marxist sense of like the people who go to work and do things they don't necessarily want to do because they have to make money. So yeah, these are people who are particularly vulnerable at this time, and the chart really shows that quite clearly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And also that Jupiter too, you know, for publishing industries, because it rules the ninth. So we're talking about publishing industries as well, which are already on the brink. Airline industries, which are already on the brink, and universities and colleges, which, you know, if we're not having the international students, they're also going to be, you know, it's not great news for them either. So
No.
Well, it'll be interesting to see where all of these go, but, you know, yeah. Any other questions, Wade?
A few, but I think probably, did you have another thing to present?
Well,
or
the only last one was the Mars retrograde.
Great, let's jump into it. Yeah, let's jump in.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we're going to have a really sticky time late September, early October, mostly because we're going to have on this chart, we're going to have the Mars retrograde happening on the Aries Ingress MC at the same time that it will be squaring Saturn, which will be here where Pluto, Jupiter and Mars all are in the Aries Ingress. So there's going to be a lot of pressure put onto these areas and situations that, you know, Australia will not be able to put themselves up. There won't be that idea. The government, I just feel like the government won't be functioning as well as it could be at that time, or that there could be internal pressures. And this is when I'm wondering whether or not there'll be industrial strikes or industrial actions or things that are happening that really put the government under a pressure that it doesn't have the resources or the energy to be able to respond to, because it's ruling planet Mars will quite literally be going backwards, retrograding over this point. So it's almost like there'll be too much going on for it to be able to handle it. And the Saturn will be just grinding away at that. And I wonder whether this is also, whether there'll be pressure from foreign nations in some way to try to come to some agreement, you know, with this being seventh house. So, and whether Australia will potentially put themselves back into that subservient role to be able to at least just get some money through the door or some connection and some support at that time. But, you know, 25th of September, we'll have the moon in Capricorn right on the Saturn of the part of this. And then the 3rd of October, it'll be up there in the Aries at that time as well. So I feel like things, especially on the 3rd of October, there'll be an inflammation, and the common people will almost be, I don't know if it'll be a fight with the government, or there'll just be some kind of feeling of things just not working the way the government wants them to, and almost, yeah, people rising up against this. What are your thoughts on this, Rob?
Yeah, the retrograde's huge for this year, and now that we're all cooped up inside, having Mars, you know, retrograde through its own sign, there's just, I think there's going to be a lot of pent up frustration and perhaps even anger, just as this thing drags on, I think, and as we realize that we might not have a return to normal as soon as we might want, and those sorts of things start to become more real around that second part of the year. For Australia, it's in that retrograde's going through the first house of the swearing in chart. So I think it's about the country, you know, in general will have a bit of a crisis moment, and as you said, it's going to be squaring the Capricorn stuff and the you know, in the natal chart for Australia, we have a Capricorn 10th anyway. So yeah, like there you go. So you can see that that's going to cause a lot of I think tension in this country around that time. I think, yeah, I don't really have much more on that transit. The transit that I thought was interesting to see is the the upcoming transit of Saturn over the MC for Australia, which is it's kind of starting already. We're kind of we're kind of in the midst of it right now, but it's going to bounce back into Capricorn and then ingress back into Aquarius again later in the year, hitting that very sensitive point of the midheaven. So, you know, like I've said again and again, that these charts are really showing the government taking a lot of action, but also I think taking a lot of flack for what it's trying to do here. I think this is going to be a real testing time for the government. What that means in terms of like elections and things, I'm not going to venture into, but I do think, well, it's returning to its own domicile, so that's something, you know. But Saturn always, I think, asks a lot of us, asks a lot of responsibility from us, and asks us to work hard. So I think there's tests ahead for the Australian government, and I think the Saturn cycle just kind of just emphasizes that right now.
Actually, I had a bad thought. I had a bad thought that Saturn returning to that point could potentially be us re-seeing the virus come back again and us having to shut the borders again. I hope not. But
well, that was my fear with the Mars in the 12th, really. If you know, if I'm honest with you, was that there would be some sort of foolish misstep in the way that we in the way that we, you know, manage this, and that leads to some trouble. But yeah, I think the transits look tough for the government right now. Anyone in government in Australia right now is going to struggle, and there's going to be a lot of criticism, I think. I don't think that's going to happen now. I think people are reasonably satisfied with the government's response to things now. I think what's going to really test things, and what's really going to be the make or break point, is when the decision comes about when to lift the shutdown and to lift the you know, to return to normal, if you like. That decision could be a make or break one. And I think it's one of those damned if you do, damned if you don't type situations, where if you do things too early, then people will criticize you. If you do things too late, people will criticize you. So either way, I wouldn't want to be the PM right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess the thing I see with that MC in Aquarius is that we are a nation of innovators and we are a nation of entrepreneurs. I mean, Australia has invented so many amazing things. I don't know if people are aware of this, you know, everything from the black box in aeroplanes to cochlear implants and pacemakers. And we've really, you know, but we don't invest in it enough as a nation. And I wonder if maybe, especially with the Jupiter-Saturn alignment on the 21st of December happening at this point, like close enough, whether or not this will kind of be a wake up for the government to go, right, that's what we need to turn back to. We need to be a nimble nation rather than kind of holding ourselves back and just relying on the mining industry and the farming industry, those primary industries. Can we move back into putting more into science, putting more into innovation? We might have to be forced to under these circumstances. So that's a bit of silver lining for it anyway.
There you go. Well, I think that we need to be a bit optimistic at least in these times. And I think we can see that in the Aries Ingress with Mars conjunct Jupiter, which rules the 9th house in the Aries Ingress chart. So I think that shows that, sorry, not the Aries Ingress chart, it rules the 9th in the swearing in chart. And I think that shows that the government will listen to scientists and will be sort of have its ear, will have its, you know, it will be listening to what learned people have to say, and that's the 9th house, and possibly that could include science and things like that. And then also with Uranus moving through Taurus, again, this might be a time for us to rethink how we make money, and Uranus being innovation and whatnot. So I think there could be a scenario where we come out of this a much more adaptable and sort of future-proofed nation if we play our cards right and listen to the right voices.
Someone send this to Scott Morrison, huh?
Oh gosh.
Can you imagine? Anyway.
Yeah, we can get his birth time as well while we're at it.
So Wade, how are you going there? I think we're reaching time, aren't we?
Yeah, and so far, I think every question that has come up, I think in one way or another, you have responded to if we gave you enough time. So I think you guys have done pretty well. We can go ahead and wrap up. Any final thoughts that you guys might have, and then ship off, I guess.
Well, did you have any sort of closing remarks, Alicia?
I just, just to wrap up, really what we've been talking about is there is some future-proofing possibility in this. Really, I feel this will be drawing us together as a nation more. And I hope that in doing that, we'll be embracing all industries and all cultures within us. This is kind of this is what Australia is now. We're a big melting pot. And there's so much knowledge and information in everything that we've got that we can really become, I don't know, I feel like, especially with all the stuff in the third house, that we'll be drawing on a lot of neighbouring countries. So it may be almost working with New Zealand, the Pacific Rim, maybe even some of Asia Pacific, to really just become stronger, to become better in those kinds of ways. But yeah, it's not all doom and gloom, but there's definitely times that we need to be able to just keep an eye out for and to be aware of, just because that Aries Ingress chart plugs in so much into our Aquarian chart too. So
yeah, absolutely agree. Yeah, I think drawing on our friends and allies is going to be really helpful in this, and I think to me that's the really nice thing to see in the Ingress chart, is that with Venus in the 11th, so strong in its own sign and in such a great house. Like the 11th is one of the, it gets a really good rap in the traditional astrology books, the 11th house. So having the moon squaring Venus there, I think shows that with the support of our friends and allies, and that's not just overseas and sort of in a national sense, but I think also like just from a community perspective, if we can come together and find that community spirit, which is the 11th house, that will help us get through. And I think that Taurian energy that is so clear in the Australian birth chart, and that you can see so well in the Australian people's kind of national character of being, strong, strong and resolute and fun-loving as well with the Venus rulership. I think that it's that community spirit and that sense of friendship between us that's going to see us through this. Yeah. We need to, if we're going to draw on anything, if we're looking for where we're going to get our strength from to get through this difficult time, I think look to our friends, look to our community. Those are the places that we're going to find the energy to sustain us through this.
Yeah, cool. So I noticed a few people in the chat have been asking about our details. So there they are.
Yes, I'm just about to ask if you wanted to advertise anything.
Anything
Rob.
coming up?
You go first.
Sure. So we're just too polite. That's the problem. My horary practice is still humming along nicely despite all of this. So I'm available to take horary questions, and you can find out more about horary astrology on my website at oldschoolastrology.com. I still haven't rolled out my natal readings. I keep promising to do this and then pushing it back. But I do want to have that roll out by the end of this year. That's my goal. So keep an eye out for news about that and other things that are happening in my life. Probably the best way is on Twitter, which is at @oldschoolastro. So you can find me there.
Cool. And I'm not really a tweeter. I'm more an Instagrammer. So if you want to follow me, I do weekly forecasts and all sorts of stuff over there. Write lots of articles, including some mundane stuff. I do have a webinar coming up, which is on the nodes. I haven't quite put it on my website yet. I will do that tonight after this. But yeah, that'll be happening on this Wednesday, May the 6th. So that's just on the change of the nodes, moving into Sagittarius and Capricorn, and the eclipse cycles ahead and what the possibilities of that are. And I have my regular new moon gatherings as well. So the next one's coming up for that will be on Thursday the 30th. This Thursday, the 23rd of April. Sorry, not even sure what day it is at the moment. It's COVID-19. ceilings. So yeah.
All right, fantastic. Listen, everybody is blowing up the chat box with gratitude for you guys and excitement about your work. You guys did fantastic. I think we all learned a great deal, and just want to say thank you so much for giving your time. It's been really fantastic. And everybody who's joined, we have a couple more coming up over the next few days. So just in a few hours, we've got the UK, and then we'll explore Hong Kong and China, and then the USA. I'll be there for all of those. So if you're interested in joining, you can use the same login details. You don't need to wait for another email. It'll be in the exact same meeting room. So feel free to go ahead and use that same link. And where you've registered on Eventbrite, you can find the times in UTC or GMT. And also in local times. But I hope you've enjoyed this. I will say that we're also planning to do a Cancer Ingress conversation where we'll explore some of these charts in more detail, especially the eclipse at 0 degrees of Cancer. So, you know, we'll be finding some exciting stuff as we move through the rest of the year. But thanks so much for joining, everybody, and we'll go ahead and sign off now.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks, Wade, for hosting us.
Absolutely.
Yes, thank you, Wade.
All right, bye.
See you guys. Bye.
Bye.